To our first discussion and design session for DemocracyXChange, Canada's democracy conference. My name is Kareem Bardisi, and I'm one of the co-chairs of DemocracyXChange and the executive director of the Ryerson Leadership Lab at Ryerson University, one of the founding partners of DemocracyXChange, along with the Open Democracy Project. We hope that you and your loved ones are staying healthy in this time of distancing and solidarity. Before we begin, I would like to give the land acknowledgement at Ryerson, the land that I'm on and the land that Ryerson is on. We do this as a symbolic and restorative act, one among many we hope to follow and part of a wider, more transformative reconciliation project here at Ryerson University, and mindful that next week we celebrate National Indigenous Peoples Day in Canada. Ryerson, as well as the territory I'm on, is on the territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and Huron-Wendat. It's covered by the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, Treaty 13, and the Williams Treaties. And we're committed to honoring our obligations to these nations, treaties, and to justice for Indigenous peoples more generally. In this project, we hope to do that by bringing in more Indigenous voices to help co-create our program and create space at DemocracyXChange 2020 to discuss reconciliation and colonialism in Canada and beyond. I'll note that this video town hall is being recorded and will be shared along with a summary of the events for later on. Today's the first time that DemocracyXChange has gathered together in an online platform, but definitely not the last. As I mentioned, DemocracyXChange is the annual summit for Canada's emerging democracy sector to connect, learn, and share. In addition to the Ryerson Leadership Lab and the Open Democracy Project, key partners in this project are our co-founding partners, the Morris Wass Center for Dialogue at Simon Fraser University, the Ryerson Democratic Engagement Exchange and the Jarislowsky Chair at Ryerson University, the Toronto Public Library, and the Samara Center for Democracy. We bring leading thinkers and practitioners together to discuss the most pressing challenges and opportunities for democratic engagement and how we can come together to build change in our community, in our institutions, in our world. And we recently announced that we'll be convening in an online format from October 13th to 15th, and for a week-long democracy festival in the week subsequently. I can't think of a really two better people to help set the stage for the kind of work we're going to have to do. And the kind of work that really has changed for so many people, or has had some people double down on the work they were already doing since the pandemic started. Since we've been living the pandemic, we've seen the power of collective action in our institutions and in community. New waves of organizing and solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement, with Indigenous peoples in Canada, new ways of mobilizing internationally, institutions responding more quickly than many people could have ever imagined, whether it was to provide wage subsidies and benefits for those in need, to those institutions that are stepping up and stepping into the space to provide needed equipment to help respond to the pandemic. At the same time, we've also seen institutions not being as flexible as they need to be, and often not providing the leadership that we need. So we're hoping to use some of this space today to discuss these issues and to discuss them with an expert practitioner, someone who's looked at movements across the United States to understand what makes them tick and what makes them, what lessons we can learn from movements from a variety of political perspectives. The design part of today's discussion and design session will focus on how we can reimagine the DemocracyXChange Summit itself. So after a conversation, after Harry's remarks and the conversation with Sanjay and with all of us together, we'll be going to breakout rooms to help us, the DemocracyXChange planning group, better understand how we can proceed with the design of the summit. Now to open it off, I'm really happy to introduce our moderator, Sanjay Ruparelia. He's the inaugural chair, Jarislowsky Democracy Chair at Ryerson University. He looks at the politics of democracy, inequality, and development, focusing on India, China, and the Global South, and has started the Front Lines of Democracy public lecture series at Ryerson, and joined Participedia, a global crowdsourcing platform to share knowledge of democratic innovations in civic participation and institutional reform. With that, welcome to all of you, and Sanjay, please take it away.
Okay, thanks, Kareem. Well, it's a great pleasure to introduce our guest today, Professor Hahrie Han, who's the inaugural director at the SNF Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins University, where she's also a professor of political science. She is a very prolific scholar, the author of several books on the topic we're discussing today. And her areas of expertise are really civic participation, political action, social movements, and particularly this concern about how do you revitalize democracies through greater civic engagement. I'll just mention a few of her books. She's the author of 3 in recent years: How Organizations Develop Activists, Civic Associations and Leadership in the 21st Century; Groundbreakers, How Obama's 2.2 million volunteers transformed campaigning in America; and Move to Action, Motivation, Participation, and Inequality in American Politics. She's also published in some of the most prestigious journals in the American Academy, including the American Political Science Review, the American Sociological Review, the American Journal of Sociology, and also premier media outlets such as the New York Times and the Washington Post. Her latest book, which will be out this fall in 2020, has a really intriguing title: Prisms of the People, Power and Organizing in 21st Century America. So we're really delighted to have you here. And we're just going to start with Professor Han offering an overview of some of the work she's done and how she got into this sort of field. And then we'll have a conversation and open it up to the audience. Thanks very much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Sanjay, for that very nice introduction. And thank you, Kareem, and the whole team for inviting me to be here with you all today. I'm only sorry that it's not in person, that it's on Zoom, but it's wonderful to see everyone. I thought that I would start just by offering a little bit of an overview about how I got into this work, and then some of the broad questions that I've tried to focus on. And then I'm really happy to take the conversation in whatever directions people want to go. But by way of introduction, so I grew up in Texas, in the southern part of the United States, as a daughter of Korean immigrants. My parents had immigrated from Korea in the early 1970s, and I was born in the United States. And I think that my parents, they'd come from very well-established families in Korea, but when they immigrated to the US, Korea was still a developing economy at the time, so their money didn't go very far. And so a lot of what I experienced growing up was the experience of watching my parents try to figure out, A, how to make it economically and financially in the United States, but then B, what it meant to be American. What did it mean to sort of raise kids in America? And so, they used to take us to on summers, we used to get in the car and they would drive us around the United States to national parks, and they would take us to Mount Rushmore because they felt like that's what Americans did, and so there are these pictures of me wearing a Mother Goose sweater in front of Mount Rushmore because it felt like that was what we were supposed to do, as kids. And, and politics was not something that we talked about at the dinner table at all, because my dad is still not a citizen. My mom didn't get naturalized until I was older. And, getting involved in their political community was not something that was part of my parents' experience, really. And instead, the kinds of things that we would talk about would be things like, how do you butter your bread? For people that grew up in cultures that eat bread, it seems like a very natural question, but for people who don't, it was this puzzle, when do you rip it, and when do you slice it, and when do you butter the top, and when do you butter the side, and what do you do with all the crumbs that fall everywhere? And, there are all these questions that we would talk about and have these really intentional conversations, try to understand what that meant. And I give you this background only by way of saying that even though I grew up in a family, I think that where politics was not a big part of my experience or the conversation that we had, I think what was a big part of it was this idea that transformation is fundamental to the human experience, right? That the experience of being the child of immigrants, I think no one ever had to tell me it, but I sort of felt like, part of what we do as humans is try to remake ourselves so that we can remake the family and therefore remake the world around us. And that was a lot of what I saw my parents trying to do when I was growing up. And so when I went to college, as an undergrad, I got involved in student activism more by happenstance and accident than anything. And it was through student activism that I landed in a class on community organizing, not because I knew what it was, but because someone told me that I could get academic credit for doing the work that I was going to be doing anyways. I thought, well, that sounds great, So I took this class on organizing, and it just opened up this world of imagination for me that I had never really understood before, because I think for the first time, it felt very resonant with a lot of the things that I experienced as a kid, as a sort of Asian immigrant in Houston, Texas growing up. It helped speak to a lot of things that I felt were true, but never knew that people really had, there are people out there who had an analysis around it. You know, like when you're a kid, whatever you experience is just what you think the world is, and you kind of just accept it. And all of a sudden I realized, wow, there's people out there who have an analysis on it and trying to work in and trying to change it in a different way. And so that's really how I got interested in politics. And so after college, I went and I worked in, you know, kind of practical, you know, mainstream US politics for a few years, and then eventually decided I want to go back to grad school. And I think I went to grad school thinking that I really just wanted a break from, I'd been working on some political campaigns. I kind of wanted a break from the sort of daily hurly-burly of being involved in politics and have the opportunity to sort of step back and reflect a little bit. But I always thought that I would go back into politics after grad school. But once I went to grad school, it turned out that I really loved the research and the teaching more than I thought I would, you know, and so I ended up sort of staying in academia, and, you know, one thing led to another, and here I am, you know, 15 years later, still doing the same thing. But I sort of give you that background by way of saying that I think that a lot of those experiences that I had kind of really inform the way that I approach the work that I want to do. And so the research lab that I run, we call it the P3 lab. And the reason why we call it the P3 lab is because it's dedicated to trying to understand how you make the participation of ordinary people possible, probable, and powerful, right? So people have to be able to participate, they have to want to participate, and then it has to matter. And I think increasingly over the past you know, decade or so, our work has really increasingly fallen into these the 2 second buckets, you know, which is how do organizations or movements or networks, how do they pull people off the sidelines into public life, right? Especially the people that are historically marginalized or the hardest to reach. Like, how do they engage them in the sustained ways that we know are really necessary to remake the democracy and the society that we want? So that's the kind of probable bucket. But then the second one really is this question of how do we make it matter? You know, I think that one of the things that we're seeing increasingly all over the world is that people can pour into the streets, people can take all sorts of actions, and then government doesn't necessarily respond. And so this question of how you create the vehicles or the scaffolding through which the participation of ordinary people gets translated into the power and influence over the things they care about has occupied more and more of our work in recent years. And we've been, you know, all the work that we do with an eye towards, we do it in partnership with movements on the ground. And so most of the movement organizations that we work with are in the US, although not exclusively so, and focused on questions having to do with racial justice, economic justice, trying to sort of understand how we essentially create the sort of vehicles and the scaffolding that we need to remake a sort of, you know, pluralistic, multiracial democracy, which in a way, I think is the promise of what we, the United States and so many other countries around the world need to confront in the 21st century. But, you know, history doesn't give us a lot of examples for how that can actually work, you know? And so I, you know, come into this conversation, you know, keenly aware that even though we had scheduled this, I think, I can't remember exactly when we scheduled it, but certainly it was before George Floyd, you know, and all the kind of protests that's been unfurling over the past couple of weeks in the United States had happened. And, you know, we didn't know exactly what we'd be facing when we came into this conversation, but, you know, we're coming into this conversation about democracy in a moment when it feels like you have this, you know, not only in the United States, but all over the world, this kind of outpouring of people's unrest and anger, and in some ways they're kind of like withdrawal of public consent, you know, around the sort of systems that we've created. And so it raises this new question, I think, of not only the, you know, vital questions around policing and everything that's at the center of the debate right now, but also I think this bigger question for all of us, which is how do we reimagine the democracy that we want, you know, and what are the kind of vehicles of civil society, you know, of collective action that we need to help realize that new vision? And so, you know, I'll just sort of say that a couple of thoughts that I have on that front, and then maybe I'll shut up for a few minutes and see what questions you guys have. You know, so so some of the work that we've done recently, you know, I've started to use this analogy of prisms as a way of thinking about the sort of vehicles that we want to create for people. And the reason why we think about it in terms of prisms is, you know, if you think about it, like, you know, usually you have, you know, some sort of like box, and white light in turns into white light out, right? But what a prism does is it takes white light in, and then instead of projecting white light out, that prism sort of converts the white light into a rainbow or a vector of light that carries out. And in some ways, those are the kind of organizations or movements that we need, that can take people and their actions in and then convert them into vectors of power and light that carry as far as they can go. And so the vital question, I think, for all of us to be asking then is, you know, what is the design at the heart of that prism then that makes possible that conversion or that transformation from, you know, white light into a vector of power? And, you know, as I look around in the US at like what's, you know, happening in Minneapolis, for example, you know, in response to George Floyd, and in other cities across the United States, you know, these movements that have been on the ground for years now are able to not only harness those relationships to, you know, to kind of generate all this outpouring of action into the streets, but also to be simultaneously moving a political process that is forcing elected leaders and institutions of government to rethink what relationship they want to have with the public. You know, what does it mean in the US context to have a police force that actually is accountable to the community? You know, what does it mean to reimagine the ability of people to hold leaders accountable to a multiracial majority or something like that? And I think that as we watch these processes unfold, we're in this moment right now where we're not just tweaking we're not just tweaking democracy at the edges, but we're sort of fundamentally remaking the way that our politics works. You know, we're trying to rethink, like, what does it mean for people, regular people, you know, in their everyday lives, to have the opportunity to do public life, you know, to not just be consumers of democracy, but actually to be agents of it. And how do they do that in a way that's grounded in their own experience, that's connected to each other, and where they have ownership over the process of change? And in order to make that a reality, which I think is fundamentally what democracy is ultimately about, you know, we have to remake, you know, what democracy is. We have to take that experience that so many people are having, I think, right now, where they cross that bridge from just being a consumer to becoming an agent of democracy, to seeing their voice being enacted in the public sphere, and then put them at the center of a new politics that we want to create, and make that experience that some people are having the experience that everybody has, right? And that's the kind of, I think, reimagining that we need to do. And so, you know, I think a lot of the lens that I bring onto this is trying to think about, you know, what are the kinds of spaces that we need to create to enable more and more people to have that kind of experience. So maybe I'll pause there, and then I think I said lots of words for a long time, and then see what questions or discussions that you all want to have.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, you raised at least a dozen really important questions. We could go on lots of ways. So let me start by asking you, so sort of two broad questions. So one is really about trying to understand what's happened in the United States in terms of political participation and civic action. And the other is about how your scholarship and your work sort of tries to understand those changes. It's something quite distinctive about the way you approach these questions. So on the one hand, I mean, one way you could sort of frame what's happening in the US is, I think many of our listeners may be familiar with it, maybe not, a book that made a lot of waves in the academy in 2000 by Robert Putnam, a political scientist, Harvard, called Bowling Alone, and where he sort of tracked the decline of civic participation, civic engagement in American public life in the 1960s. And hence the title of the book, Bowling Alone. We no longer join bowling leagues to go bowling, but we were bowling by ourselves. We weren't joining PTA clubs. We weren't joining neighborhood associations. We were voting less. It was sort of a general malaise, a civic malaise in American public life. And so if you take that as a starting point, maybe it's not the right one, but just for the sake of an argument, you know, in 2000, there's a real sense of disaffection, cynicism, enemy in American public life in many established Western democracies. And if you take from that period to today, these 2 decades, you do see these sort of movements that are crystallizing at various points. The invasion of Iraq in 2003-4 is a sort of anti-war movement that begins to mobilize. Of course, something you've written about, Barack Obama's incredible campaign, which really mobilized a whole new generation of people into politics, but also inspired a backlash in the Tea Party movement. And then you have the election of Donald Trump, and regalvanizes the women's movement and many other movements, and of course, Black Lives Matter. So one thing is to try to understand that trajectory. How does your work and how what you studied sort of situated within that sort of trajectory of developments and events? And the second is connected to that, which is something very distinctive about your work, is the focus on the organizations. I mean, the title of one of your books really pulls it, really sort of speaks to that, which is how organizations develop activists. So in the literature on social movement, civic action, typically there are these debates, what really matters, what really draws people into movements, and what makes movements successful, as you know. So some people say it's about changes in politics, new opportunities, new openings that are created. You could say negatively also crises that sort of push people, from being passive spectators to active citizens. A second would be the organizational resources. What resources does an organization have to deploy? And the third would be cultural frames. How is it that movement leaders and movement activists themselves try to frame their arguments? What narratives do they use to resonate with a broad public? So a lot of your work really focuses in on the characteristics of the organization and how those organizational characteristics do 2 different things, it seems. One is compel a certain kind of leadership, which is committed and passionate and engaged. And the second is to both invite and recruit citizens into those organizations and movements, but then also keep them there and help them stay. So I was wondering if you had any sort of general reaction to that. So thinking about how do we think about this moment in American politics today in the context of the last 2 decades, and not least, we haven't mentioned it yet, the pandemic and the severe institutional political crisis that has been revealed at the heart of the American Democratic Republic and in many other countries around the world too. So I wonder if you could say a little bit more about how you think of that.
Okay, so big questions. So let me offer a few thoughts that kind of came to mind as you were talking. So certainly like the work of Robert Putnam and the kind of idea, the notion of sort of social capital and the declining kind of connectedness of people is definitely foundational to the kind of work that I do. I think that sometimes I feel like I'm in conversations with people and they're saying, oh, and the reaction will be like, oh, you're just saying that like we need more social capital, right? Like we need more people bowling together. And I think my answer to that is that really it's a yes and, right? Like, yes, we need people to be more connected together, and that social fabric of our communities does absolutely matter. But I think that to stop there is also fundamentally one of the problems that we have faced in our democracy, that to mistake social capital for power is to misunderstand democracy as being about connectedness and not about people being actual agents of change, And I think that that's one of the struggles that we're seeing in a lot of the protest movements that are unfolding, not only in the United States in response to George Floyd, but in Hong Kong. And, like a lot of the kind of big protest movements that we've seen around the world, it's people trying to sort of reclaim their hold on their ability to have voice, to hold government accountable to their interests. And the pandemic really brought that to a head, I think, because any democracy or government that forces people to make the choice between hunger and health, is not meeting its most basic responsibilities as a government, right? A government's most basic responsibility is solve problems in people's lives. And if people have to choose between hunger and health, then I think it raises a lot of questions about legitimacy and accountability of government. And so to me, I think that like the social capital piece is like is definitely fundamental to what we need to be thinking about. But the question I think that we're grappling with in this moment, or that we see people grappling with, this question of, even if I create these civically or socially connected communities, how do I draw power from that community? And that question of how you draw power, I think, is a really tough question in this current moment that we're thinking about. And so to kind of tie that, so the trajectory that you described, Bush to Obama and the backlash to the Tea Party, and then now to Trump, is certainly a real one. And I think that, we're in this moment right now in the 21st century of tremendous change, economic change, technological change, globalization, climate change, like all these different forces are coming together. And so it's creating a moment of real uncertainty where I think in America, at least, and certainly in a lot of other countries around the world, we're seeing is this kind of fundamental grappling with who do we want to be as a society. And so that like swinging back and forth, that you described in the US, I think is part of that kind of grappling with this question of who we want to be, which we also saw, by the way, at the turn of the 20th century in the US, when it's the end of the not the end, but the sort of, you had this kind of transition to the Industrial Revolution, a changing information environment, the spread of mass media through newspapers and other things like that, and the kind of, urban migration, the kind of increasing diversification of different communities. And there are these questions raised about who we want to be as the United States. Now that, of course, that conversation sort of ended in a world war, which we hope that we do not get to now. But there's this kind of similar moment of uncertainty and grappling, I think, where all these kind of political, economic, and social forces are coming together. But then the point that you raised at the end about, I think it is true. Like I do often when I talk about my work, especially to other political scientists, let's say, one thing that's different about the approach that we take to our work compared to other scholars might be that we do have a really strong organizational focus to it, and I'm using the term organization loosely here, I should say. Like I don't necessarily mean like a bureaucratic nonprofit organization. It could also be a movement, it could be a network, but some sort of vehicle or scaffolding through which collective action is channeled, I think is what we're interested in. And the reasons for that are twofold that I'll give you. The first is that I think a lot of studies of social movements and collective action, as you point out, will look at things like, what are the kind of political opportunity structures that make social change more likely? What are the narrative frames that movements can use, or what are the resources they can mobilize to make change happen? And I think that as we were looking around and thinking about where the movements and the organizations that are most powerful in this 21st century moment, the thing that was most common across all the movements that we were looking at is that they were all operating in environments of tremendous uncertainty, right? So the only thing that's certain is uncertainty, right? And the only thing that's certain is that if you're trying to make change, at some point, someone's going to try to check your power. So it could be, an establishment political party, it could be an elected official, it could be the opposition, it could be like any number of different players, but someone's going to push back on your attempts to make change at a certain point. And the question, I think, really is that when movements and organizations get that pushback, which is inevitable in my mind, how do they respond, and what are the tools that they have at their disposal to be able to respond? And so the reason that I'm framing it that way is that if we sort of understand the goal of these movements is really building political power, right, then power has to be understood as this kind of like dynamic, exchange between movements and their targets, and this, sort of like ongoing sort of back and forth about what they want. And so to that end, that's why these kind of vehicles of collective action, these organizations, these movements, what have you, become so important, because those are the vehicles through which movements kind of both develop and protect the resources that they need to respond in those moments of uncertainty. So if you're operating in a more a more certain political environment, then yes, maybe there is a chance where you can, get 10,000 signatures on a petition, go deliver it to the elected official, and they're like, great, we'll do what you want, right? But that's just not how it works most of the time these days. And so the question is, you get those 10,000 signatures, you go to the elected official, they say, no, thank you. And then what do, right? And if you don't have this sort of infrastructure of collective action to fall back on, then I think the resources that the organizations have are really, really limited. And so that's part of the reason why we have that view of organizations. The second is there's a there's an economist from the mid 20th century who I cite all the time. It's a guy named Albert Hirschman, who wrote this book called Exit, Voice, and Loyalty. And I love it because I think it's sort of really relevant for this moment. And his argument, which Sanjay, I know that you know, but I'll just sort of rehearse it here quickly, is, the idea that, if we think about all the organizations that structure our economic and political and social lives, right? There's certain organizations that operate with the logic of exit, right? Which is the idea of, if I decide I don't like your product, then I'm going to exit, right? So if I don't like the ketchup that you make, I'm going to buy someone else's ketchup. If I don't like your cereal, if I don't like Chex, I'm going to go buy Cheerios, right? And it's essentially the logic of markets, right? And the idea that if I don't like what you're offering me, I'm just going to sort of vote with my feet and I'm going to go somewhere else. And his argument is that's how market works and how market organizations work. But political organizations should really operate not with the logic of exit, but they should operate with the logic of voice, right? And the logic of voice is this idea that if I don't like your product, right, which could be a policy or a candidate or a statement or something, then instead of exiting and saying, well, forget you, I'm going to go buy my cereal somewhere else, that I stay and I exercise voice, right? That I stay and fight for what I think is right within the organization. And the extent to which people are willing to do that work of exercising voice is a function of what Hirschman calls loyalty, hence the title of the book, Exit, Voice, and Loyalty. I would use the term commitment. Do people have the commitment that they need to stay and grapple with the questions of what it means to exercise voice? And I think that to me, those questions of commitment and voice are fundamental to the moment that we're in, because in any kind of pluralistic, multiracial democracy, there is this question of how do we come together, right, as people who have very different lived experiences, some of whom, and those experiences are very structured by institutions of power in our society, to create a different kind of solidarity, right, where we have the commitment to stick with each other in moments of uncertainty, of dynamic change, and to figure out how we each exercise our voice to create a new source of power from below, and so, like, to me, that's where the sort of, it's like, that's the piece I feel like that we've lost so much that we need to kind of remake in a way.
So that actually was, as you were speaking, I mean, that was a question I wanted to ask you, that if you could say a little bit more for us, so using that rubric of voice and loyalty. So how do you inspire when in the organization, both in the work that you've done and in the movements and organizations you've studied, what makes them successful at inspiring? I suppose there's two questions. What is it that they're doing as organizations in terms of how their organizations are designed or structured, or how they function, how they work, that both inspires people to participate and to express their voice? And then what generates and inspires that loyalty or commitment that you're talking about? Because you've been alluding to that in the last one.
Yeah.
And you frame it in lots of different ways, that people can be connected, but what makes them feel empowered? And in turn, what is it that organizations do that empower those citizens? So you could tell us a little bit more, and then we're going to open it up. I'm sure there are lots of questions from people who are joining here. Tell us a little bit more about sort of getting inside those organizations. What is it that they're doing that's the ones that are very successful? That's what we're trying to also learn here. What is it that they're doing that makes them successful? Because you can think of lots of different types of movements that do this. I mean, as you were speaking, I thought about Occupy Wall Street. Now, it was a very important moment, but a lot of commentators might say, well, it didn't have an organizational frame that really empowered. So there was expression, there was voice, there was probably a lot of commitment, but did it empower that movement to make the demands that, were there even a set of sort of coherent, concrete demands and so on? So the big debate about that. You compare it to something like the Tea Party movement or now Black Lives Matter. And so these seem quite different movements, and part of what makes them very distinctive are their organizational forms. And then I'm assuming from what you're saying that has it's not the only thing that matters, but it's a very important factor in determining why they were more or less successful in achieving whatever goals they had.
Yeah. So, okay, so let me answer that a couple of ways. So from a kind of more tactical answer, just to kind of start with the more practical, is so what we found in our research, which I think is consistent with what a lot of other people have found who study this, is that when you think about sort of bringing people off the sidelines and then engaging them in public life, basically it's like my my general kind of take on this, if I were to sort of sum up like a lot of things, is that there's lots of ways that you can kind of get people in the door, you know? So the different, you know, if you were to ask me, like, if I'm just trying to like get people to kind of get off their butts and take that first action, like what's the best way to do that? I don't know that I've seen any one study that says like email is better than an in-person event, or like a phone call is more effective than this, or this kind of message versus that kind of, I mean, basically I think that like, if you're a movement and you're trying to sort of get lots of people involved, what you want to do is have lots of opportunities for different kinds of people, because they're going to access you in lots of different ways, you know? So you have to have lots of different doors, and those doors have to be easy for people to push open, essentially. I don't know that any one kind of door is any more effective than others. I mean, certainly in a moment like we're seeing right now where, you know, George Floyd was like a match that lit this fire, then you want to respond to that particular political moment, but you can't necessarily predict that ahead of time. So I think there's lots of ways to get people in the door. The tougher question is, how do you get people to stay? You know? And to me, in answering that question of how you get people to stay, I don't know that I've seen any data that sort of replaces for me the kind of fundamental importance of the social connections that people have with each other, you know? And I want to be very careful and like, what I'm talking about is sort of like the relationships that people construct with each other within the movement or organization or whatever it is that you're talking about. And I actually don't know that I necessarily have strong feelings or have seen data that sort of says that they have to be face-to-face versus digital or something like that. Like, I think it is true that people tend to construct relationships more face-to-face than they do digitally, but that's not to say that we don't have evidence that there are really deep kind of socially connected communities that are constructed online, you know, that I think are actually there. So to me, it's like the fundamental, it's not so much the tactic or the way in which the relationship is constructed, but the fact that when I don't want to show up to that meeting on Thursday evening because I'm tired and I've had a long day and my kids are cranky, that I go not because I'm really committed to the issue, but I show up because I don't want my friend Sanjay to get mad at me, you know? And like, that's what we find again and again and again, is that people, when the going gets tough, the thing that keeps them connected is their commitment or their ties to other people. And so the movements that I think I see that are most effective are ones where the kind of, if we were to draw a picture of the social network, it's not just that I come from the outside the organization and I come into the organization and then I bring my 10 friends with me, which is I think what sometimes people mistake that for like relational organizing, but it's that the set of relationships and networks in the organization are constantly changing and evolving and growing, right? So what it means is that as I enter into this community, I may, not only will I bring 10 people with me, but I'm going to be meeting new people. Those new people are connecting me to new people. And so it's this constant building of strong and weak ties throughout the organization that allows it to have the sort of momentum that you need. So that's sort of just like one thing on the sort of like, I think the fundamental importance of social connectedness. But then the second question I think that you ask is, you know, if you look across at all these movements from, you know, Black Lives Matter to Occupy to the Tea Party to what have you, that they're all structured in really different ways, and they've used a variety of different tactics. And I think that like this is kind of like the sort of like maybe more academic and less practical kind of version of the answer is that, so I think, I mean, so to me, the answer is that like, right, in any given political situation, you're operating in a terrain of uncertainty. And so leaders have to sort of act agentically in response to whatever the sort of political terrain is within which they're operating. And so the key question to me for movement to ask is, I don't know what the terrain is that you're going to be operating in 6 months from now, right? Like, I mean, who knows what the world's going to be like in 6 months from now, right? Like, we're in such a moment of uncertainty right now, right? And so, but what I know is, am I doing the work right now that cultivates the kind of capacities the leaders need to be able to respond strategically, you know, in the moment that they have? And that's a function both of the strategic capacity of the leadership, but then also the strength of the constituency that they've been able to build, right? So when that leader is getting pushed back 6 months from now, will the constituency be poised and mobilized to be able to respond, you know, at the turn of a hat? Like, you know, those are kind of questions. And the questions about leadership capacity, I think, have to do a lot with, you know, we're not just waiting around for like the next gifted Martin Luther King to come around, although that would be great, right? But we're sort of asking, like, how do we create the conditions that make it more likely that the kinds of leaders we need will emerge, you know? And I think those are the kinds of questions that we can be asking. And then the connectedness to the constituency has to do with how do we set up the organization in a way that it's actually accountable to a constituency on the ground. And I think that if you look at the sort of differences between a lot of the kind of movements that we've seen in the past 10 or 15 years, like those lines of accountability are very different across the different kinds of movements. And that says a lot about whether or not you have leaders that are negotiating on behalf of people or on behalf of themselves, and sort of how that plays out in the political arena.
So I'm gonna open it up now to a lot of questions we've gotten on the notice board here. And let's see, some of them are quite sort of big systemic questions of the type we sort of been talking about, and some of them more specific. So so let me start. So this one's on Black Lives Matter. And the question is, what do you imagine the tools and actions are needed to sustain the momentum around Black Lives Matter for the long term beyond this current moment? And then I'm going to just throw in another one because I'm just watching the clock. We'll have time, but just in case we run out. And this is a more general one, which says our governing institutions are always having to catch up with social change. So that's the premise. How can or should our elected representatives lead the way in reforming democracy? You did talk about how do we reimagine our democracies or democratic politics. So the first question is on Black Lives Matter. How do you sustain the momentum about this particular movement, which is so vital and important in the United States, but of course, as Kareem began mentioning in the beginning, you know, in Canada, of course, and around the world. And the second is about the relationship between our governing institutions and civil society, and to what extent are they always trying to catch up or not, and how?
So I think the answer, so in my mind, the kind of answer to both those questions are linked, right? In the sense that, you know, I've always thought that, like, I wish someone would write this piece about, you know, like, how do you, like, what does movement leadership look like, you know? And you know, I think that, like, a lot of times I'll sort of do these kind of talks and I'll get those kind of questions. And the answer is basically, like, the best organizers that I know who are leading movements, they're constantly able to balance a whole bunch of tensions, right? And it's a tension between doing kind of outside politics and inside politics, right? Like, how do you sort of like manage, you know, protest and work in the streets in addition to moving a political process like inside the political system? How do you manage in a way that is both top down and also bottom up, right? You have to be responsive to the needs of your constituency, but you also, and this is where I think Occupy maybe didn't have this, they are too bottom up in a way. And so the ships were not all sailing in the same direction, you know? So if I'm a movement leader, I have to be bottom up. I also have to have some sort of focus to be able to sort of channel the strategic energy of a movement, you know? And, you know, how do you be, you know, both innovative and not? I mean, it's just sort of like all these tensions that any kind of like good, I think, movement leader has to balance. And so the best leaders I know are ones that are really comfortable to stepping into that tension, you know, and embracing it, and that kind of tension is being a part of what they need to do, as opposed to being like, I'm going to take an all this or all that or only this kind of approach. And so to that end, like, I think, you know, we have this enormous opportunity right now with Black Lives Matter, where, you know, things that you think that, you know, after Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri a few years ago, which is not that long ago, and Black Lives Matter emerged, and everyone said, you know, things that they're asking for are unthinkable, right. You know, and now it's 2019, it's a few years after that, and the things that people previously said were unthinkable are now at the center of the political debate, you know? And so there's this opening right now that we've just never seen before, and it's made possible in a way because the public has finally said enough, you know, like these videos of these you know, just unthinkable tragedies are we will not tolerate them anymore. So how do we remake the system? So what needs to happen to sort of sustain the energy? I mean, the kind of you know, the sort of the roiling protests that we see in cities across the US are not going to sort of last for the period of time that it takes to make true institutional change. Like, Minnesota is a place where I happen to have done work for a long time, and so I've been in conversation with, and you know, they've been thinking a lot about how do we what would it take for us to really remake the police system in Minneapolis, for example? And it's at least a 3-year process, you know? So if you, so they're at the very beginning of what's going to be a really long process. And so that's where you're going to really need, I think, these leaders that can manage both the kind of like energy and do that work of building constituency that continues, even as they're moving a political process, within, in negotiation with the political system. And the last thing I'll just sort of say there is that I think another thing that's really important for movement leaders and thinking about moving that political process is our politics has sort of gotten to a point where sometimes we mistake access to power for power itself. And I think the movements that have been the most effective have been able to earn a seat at the table, not because, a donor or a funder or a political party gave them that seat at the table, but because they earned it through their constituency. And I think that's a really important thing for Black Lives Matter to hold on to right now. They earned that seat at the table because of the constituency that they built. And so that's their source of power. And the reason why that's important is because when they're at that negotiating table for the next 3 years, there's going to be many, many, many moments when people are going to try to force them to compromise on this, to compromise on that. And the question of when they do and when they don't has to be rooted in constituency, as opposed to the need to satisfy their donor or someone who like got them at the table. And so, that's why it's sort of like, it's the both and of, sort of staying rooted in the constituency because that's your source of power, but then also, being part of that political process moving forward.
Right. So it's a very fine balance. But as you're saying, it's from the examples you're giving, it really you have to be grounded in these movements, and that gives you legitimacy and credibility to sit at a table with decision makers who are trying to.
Right.
So, but it's also remarkable, as you say, how things that were seen inconceivable suddenly are on the table.
Yeah.
Like, you don't know what it means because it means different things to different people, but people calling for defunding the police, Bernie Sanders openly saying that he's a socialist. I mean, that was unthinkable, I think, a decade ago.
Right.
When they tried to tar Barack Obama as being a socialist, he was very quick to say he wasn't. I
Right.
think because he wasn't. But the point was that it was also just seen as politically a liability.
Right.
This question you're talking about is probably links with how you ended your last set of thoughts. Do you believe in systems reform? I mean, you've already started talking about this. Or do you believe we need to abolish and start anew to realize the democracy that, and the question saying, you and I envision? So maybe it's, because your comments seem to strike as somebody who, again, it's very difficult balance about being both, being passionate about a cause, but being pragmatic at the same time. It's a hard one to balance. And so I think this is kind of, again, that do you think, how do you think about, maybe it's one of the things is, how do you think about change? Is it something that it requires a big structural overhaul? Or can you have sort of more incremental, gradual change that has more than simply incremental and gradual effects? Maybe it's another.
Yeah. So I think that, so I'm 45, and so maybe that, there's a problem, perhaps a generational component to the way that I'd answer this question. But, I think that I probably I come at this with a balance of passion and pragmatism. Like, I believe in my soul very deeply that, democracy, even if it has never functioned in the way that we've really aspired to, is, a system that gives people the opportunity to exercise voice and power over the things that matter most in their lives. And so so I think in that sense, like, I feel like we want to invest in making it work in the way that it should, and that as a part of being part of a small d democratic process, that there's this that part of what democracy does is it normalizes the idea of struggle. Struggle is central to what makes democracy work. And when we try to make it too neat and packaged and things like that, that's when we lose some of the dynamism that makes, I think, democracy possible. And so in that sense, like, I feel like, it's sort of like, I feel like the question is like, yes, I do feel like we have to reimagine the kind of system that we have. I think that there are but it's I guess, like, I know it's like so frustrating to say this, but I think it's like, it's a both and, and that you have to be able to sort of use the tools at your disposal to to make the change that you want, but then simultaneously kind of reimagine it. And so the research that I'm thinking about here is there's a book by a woman named Elizabeth Clemens called The People's Lobby. And she's looking at the turn of 20th century American politics. And the question that she asked there, this is the progressive era in US politics. The question that she asked there is that she looks at women, labor, and farmers. And she says, how was it that groups of people who didn't even have the right to participate in the political system were able to change the very rules of the game by which the system operated, right? And so that's where you saw women who are not yet allowed to vote changed the way like senators were elected, the way the ballot was sort of constructed. I mean, all these sort of like fundamental institutional reforms in US politics. And the argument that she makes is, I mean, I love it because it's very grounded in analysis of organizations, but it's these organizations that are able to sort of do the both and, to sort of make themselves legible to existing institutions of power, but then in making themselves legible to sort of push the boundaries of what people understood as appropriate. So, for an example would be that there were these women's groups who structured themselves organizationally very similar to like business lobbies of the 19th century. And that worked because when they walked into a legislator's office, a legislator would be completely flabbergasted because they'd be like, oh my God, there's a woman in my office and she's like asking for stuff, and they're taken aback by that. But they at least knew like, okay, but I know how I need to respond because I respond to them the same way I respond to other lobbyists, And so those women were in there, and so they structured themselves in a way that was sort of very legible to institutions of power, but then they had a deeply kind of like radical feminist ideology at their root that was sort of forcing the political system to kind of reimagine how it wanted to engage with groups like women who are fundamentally excluded from the system. And so it's like that kind of sort of both and, I think that historically, at least, we see as being necessary for the kind of change that we want. So.
Right, it's fascinating, that work. Sort of an organizational resonance that you.
Yeah.
So here's a question here's a question which is more challenging. So how can you say that the system represents the people's voice when our electoral system is set up to systematically exclude almost half the population? So it doesn't say what country they're talking about. I don't know if it's modern representative democracies generally, whether it's Canada or the US, it doesn't say. But this question about, I guess it raises a broader question too. I mean, there's that very specific question. One that I also was thinking about when I was reading some of your work is the relationship between civic action and voting, for instance. And when we talk about civic action is obviously crucial, but we also know that we're in an electoral system in which is gerrymandering and there's oligarchic tendencies because of the role of money. This is all legal because of certain Supreme Court judgments in some countries, like the United States, maybe not others. But this question here is about getting at more of the electoral system itself. To what extent is it really truly democratic in terms of who it empowers? How do you think about that?
Yeah, and so to be clear, I'm not sure, I may have sort of said something that kind of led to this thing. So I'm not saying the system as it at least certainly not the US system as it currently exists, like fully empowers all people or even represents all people. Like I think that's fundamentally one of the failings of the system, just to be very clear about that. It's possible. I think that what I do think is that democracy, if properly functioning, is supposed to fully represent, the broad swath of the public. And I think that's what we need to aspire to. But no, I'm not claiming that the existing system does that at all, to be clear. Now, that being said, I think that, so one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot about lately is this idea of public accountability and what does public accountability mean and where does voting fit into that? And I think one of the failings of our political system right now in the US at least is that the only systems for accountability that we really have these days are elections, and things like the pandemic sort of pointed out how hugely inadequate that is if we mistake elections for democracy, right? Democracy is supposed to be so much more than just the elections, and so the pandemic hits in March, you have all these, horrible effects on so many people's lives, and people have no choice except to wait until November, for our next election to come along to try to hope that a new government comes in to respond, right? And what really should have happened is that in that moment, in those moments in March and April and now in May and June and whatnot, that there are all these other venues through which people, the public, can hold public leaders, whether they be heads of public health agencies, elected leaders, governors, whatever, accountable to meet and solve the problems that they have in their lives, you know? And so, you know, I think the challenge is like, how do we recreate those notions of accountability within the system?
So there's still other questions to be asked, but I think we're
Yeah.
running out of time for this section. I'm going to, but that's a great way to end it, because I think that's one of the questions we might want to discuss in the breakout rooms and others that might come up. So I'm going to pass it over to Braylon, who's going to introduce the next part of the session for today's event.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for that fantastic conversation, Professor Han and Sanjay. There's still so many questions that still need to be answered along the way, and hopefully we'll have some time to do that in our breakout sessions. My name is Raylan Guppy, and I'm the communications lead for DemocracyXChange, as well as for the Ryerson Leadership Lab. And I'm going to we're going to move into our breakout sections now, which is kind of the design section of this discussion and design session, where we're going to talk about the best ways for us to incorporate some of this conversation into our DemocracyXChange platform in October, as well as the best way for us to do the reimagining of that platform in the fall. Before we move into breakout rooms, for my colleague Famita clicks, and I think Kareem wanted to jump back in for just a moment and say a few words.
Yeah, so just to note that we are going to be able to, we will be providing a video of this, and as well as a summary. And just as one motivating thing to make some of the discussion really concrete, something I failed to mention at the outset, I just really wanted to mention, one of the kind of treasured members of our community is someone around whom people in the community may want to do some concrete organizing. Maria Ressa, who was our one of our keynoters last year, and has joined us for another conversations, including most recently with Hot Docs just a couple of weeks ago, is the CEO of the Rappler and has just been found guilty of cybercrime in a definitely a dodgy court proceeding in the Philippines, and she's facing 6 months to 6 years in prison. So as one very motivating immediate aspect to what a political organization might look like, I just wanted to note that a lot of us in the DemocracyXChange community are thinking of her and in solidarity with her. And as Hari mentioned, there are a number of other spaces to look at across our communities right now for potential motivation, but I just wanted to point that one out.
Great, thank you, Kareem. So with that, we're going to head into our breakout rooms. Each one of them will be led by one of the members of the DemocracyXChange community, and we'll come back together in about 20-25 minutes. So Famita, if you want to open the breakout rooms.
I wanted to close by saying thank you, Sanjay, Jarislowsky Chair for Democracy at the Ryerson Faculty of Arts. Thank you to our co-presenting partners, the Samara Center for Democracy, Ryerson Faculty of Arts as Jarislowsky Chair and Democratic Engagement Exchange, Toronto Public Library, and Morris Wass Center for Dialogue at Simon Fraser University. I think we got some really rich input in terms of how we can proceed online. I'm going to cheat a little bit and take the key takeaway that Hari gave us in the breakout room. I was lucky enough to be in Hari's breakout room, and she just reminded us, and I think this is important as organizers of events, that the key takeaway that I got from her in our breakout room was that these virtual spaces, they can contribute to exhaustion or overload, Zoom overload. They really help break down barriers of geography, and I think that's should be pointing to us as an ambitious community of DemocracyXChange to attempt to take what is Canada's Democracy Summit and invite in voices from beyond, including in our breakout room, we had Anissa join us from Indonesia, and I noticed in the chat box, we had some folks in from other places. So we'll be sending you a survey because we want to find out how you found out about this event, given we have some mailing list reach and some social reach. Also want to thank the team at DemocracyXChange that makes this successful. Yes, Patrick, just a second. and including the stuffies that helped make this successful. The Open Democracy Project, Sabrina Dellon's the advisor of that project. My co-directors, Chris Copperthwaite and Anna Serrano, as well as Braylon Guppy and Famita Kamali, who together formed the dream team for Democracy Exchange. Thank you so much, Professor Han, for your time and wisdom. I think I speak for many in that we want to be selfish and have more of your time in October, hopefully with Marshall Gans. We noticed you used the story of self very effectively at the outset of your talk. And we want to connect you with our student community who will be fully engaged in October, as well as all the democracy activists. And we hope to see you and follow the work that you're doing, obviously, and see you and everyone on this call in Democracy Exchange 2020, October 13th to 15th. With that, I will say thank you so much, and great event. Thank you.